Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Property Trio. I'm joined, as always, by my two fabulous co-hosts, Dave Johnston and Cate Bakos. How are we, guys?
Good to see you
Very
too.
well, thanks, Mike.
I think we always have a bit of a spring in our step when we're dealing with a listener question. And I think we've got actually Josephine's a repeat offender with a listener question. So isn't it nice to sort of, have this sort of journey that they're on, and every now and then along the way they're like, I need to chat to the Property Trio again and see what the next step is.
I think she's probably the first person. There might be one or two others where we've come back and answered a question for them for a second time. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, there's no rules, and it's a good enough question that we wanted to share it online. So her question is, hi, Property Trio. Thank you so much for answering my last questions. Your insights were incredibly helpful. It was great to hear we made the right decision in how we structured our first purchase. If you want to listen to that question, you'll have to go back to episode... Dave always knows the number.
267.
Did you? Oh, there you go. So you can cut out my brr. You can go back to episode 267. Well done, Dave. That was a good little one too. All right. So Josephine's saying her partner and I are now looking to buy our second property, which we plan to eventually live in. The challenge is that our first mortgage is quite large, so servicing capacity is limited. Our maximum purchase price right now is around $650. We're starting to look because our son will be starting high school in 2 years and we'd love to be settled in the right zone by then. We're hoping to buy in either Parkdale Secondary College Zone, so suburbs like Parkdale, Mordialloc or Mentone, or in the McKinnon Secondary Zone, which is Bentley, East McKinnon or parts of Ormond. We don't want to buy in
You pronounced all suburbs correctly.
I was going to say, I reckon I maybe got through that without biffing it.
Yeah.
I could see it. I felt like you were thinking, I hope I'm getting these suburbs right.
There was no Beau Marie or Beau Morris or whatever you ruffians call it. I mean, it's a French sounding word. Like, I don't understand. Anyway, so they don't want to buy an apartment, so they've been considering a 2-bedroom unit. But even that's a stretch in some of these areas. She goes on to say, we'd like to hold on to our first property for as long as possible. It's a standalone 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, and we're both really adamant about buying a standalone home for our first purchase. At the time, though, our budget wouldn't stretch to buying in the school zones I mentioned, so we compromised on location to get the kind of property we wanted. My question is, do you think it's better to buy the 2-bedroom unit now, even though we think we'll outgrow it in 5 to 7 years, or should we hold off, build more equity, increase our incomes, and potentially buy something bigger like a 3-bedroom unit, townhouse, or house in a couple of years? Thanks again. Love your work and really value your advice. Well, that's a wonderful question, Josephine, and thank you for the kind words. Cate, this is obviously one where Dave's got a fair bit of meat on the bones in terms of the finance hurdles. But when we're talking about the suburbs and the school zones, this is I suppose, part of your backyard. It is quite a dilemma. Do you agree that it's a bit of a stretch at $650K with a budget to achieve a property purchase in those areas that are zoned for those schools?
Yeah, this one is challenging because they don't want apartments. And they've listed, particularly with McKinnon High, they're not even going to get a villa unit for under $650 in that location. If we look at the Parkdale school zone, I think a villa unit even then will be a challenge, a tiny possibility. But you're then saying to yourself, well, am I talking to these potential clients about a really tiny space for themselves when it's 3 people that will become 3 adults? By the time their son starts high school, he'll need his space and, a growing guy. And I'm fearful that for the budget, they'll be really compromising on the dwelling itself. And that's a dilemma that a lot of people face. But I think I'm questioning whether it's viable at all, whether this approach has any viability.
How strict are they on the school zones? Because I don't want to incriminate anybody, but there's a bit of a can I post my school correspondence to your house like I live there sort of stuff that goes on in some parts of New South Wales? Is it very, very strict that you actually have to be physically living there? There's no way around it?
Well, they haven't asked us in this whether whether they could buy something, a bolt hole in the school zone, and pop a tenant in there, paying them directly, and tell the school that that's their address, and then swap mail. Like, that hasn't come up in this question. It certainly comes up in conversations with people who are looking at ways that they can get a cost-effective entry into a school zone without actually having to live there. And I think the reality is those conversations take place, and those actions possibly, I'm sure that they happen around the place. But I'm looking at this question from our listener and thinking they're asking us for advice on what looks like a definite plan to actually live there.
Sure.
So that being the case, I don't think that this approach is viable.
Well, if it is something they think is viable, they now have heard a way to do it.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd say it's pretty rare, but it does happen. Mike is probably the short answer. So
if they're thinking that they want to make this work and live in there while he's in his own school, I don't think that $650 is going to give him a product that will work for a growing family.
All right. Well, Dave, we need to bring this back for Josephine, because so far it's not some great news from Cate, and I think that Josephine probably knows that it is always that was always going to be the challenge at $650. What other options could we table for Josephine outside of the plan A of getting a house in that location sub $650?
Yeah, well, I guess, look, if we look at sort of from a property planning perspective, I suppose there's probably 4 different options, and these options are reasonably consistent when people are considering this type of conundrum. Do I keep the existing property and upgrade? Do I keep it and buy an investment property? Do I sell and upgrade? What is the best pathway for me? This is probably the most common property planning area that we assist people with, really. So if we go through them, like if we start with, say, point 1, you can do as Josephine suggested and compromise and buy the apartment, but Cate has just talked through some of the reasons that's going to be pretty difficult. And not to mention, even if it was affordable, like, what's it going to be like for the family to live in that property from a lifestyle perspective for a significant period of time? Yeah. So you could unravel that further, but just, so that's option 1. Option 2, sell their current home, and that would be capital gains tax free, and then upgrade to a home within the zones that they ultimately would like to live in, and ideally that would be a forever home. But if it's not a forever home, you want it to be as long as possible home, which is really ideally 7 to 10 years. Option 3, they could wait it out and hope they can buy something bigger in the zone they want to be in, and wait out for that higher borrowing capacity as their incomes increase. But there's obviously a lot of risk associated with that. Will their income get large enough by the time their son's ready to go to the school? Will they find something they want in that time frame?
Will the market grow faster than they can grow their income is another risk in Victoria as well, right? Because we haven't necessarily seen it in the data, but anecdotally on the ground, it's pretty hot out there.
Yeah, and the data's getting stronger. And then probably the 4th option is to rent vest. And, then they can rent vest in the preferred school zone, which has all sorts of challenges within itself, and just purely look to purchase the best investment property they can with their $650,000. So they're essentially the 4 options, and we'll slowly work our way towards what we would recommend.
Well, on that point, Dave, when we're sort of giving advice of, like, I would select option 1 or 3 or 4 or what have you, we can't really get into Josephine and her partner's frame of mind, right? Because there is sometimes the right decision from a financial point of view, but there's also a right decision for the family. So notwithstanding that, if we are just kind of looking at this in a vacuum, which option stands out to you as the most favourable?
And look, as most of our listeners will know, I try to and often overlay it with the family perspective. And, you could call that the lifestyle perspective. And generally speaking, for anyone who does want to purchase a home, I think the sooner they get the big rock in the jar, the better, because then it simplifies your life, your family. You're able to pay down that debt, so then you've got a longer runway to focus purely on investing. So, but you're right, like we're not sitting here having an extended conversation with Josephine and her husband or partner. We're not able to see their reactions to different questions. So obviously this is just based purely off the information we know that she's provided with us. So all that said, personally, look, I think what I would look to do in their shoes is, so I've looked at the median values of those 6 suburbs. Mordialloc has the lowest median value of 1.353 million. Then you've got Parkdale at 1.47, Mentone at 1.4, Bentley 1.68, McKinnon 177, Ormond 177. So goodness. I think, sorry?
I just said goodness. I mean, that puts in perspective the 650 budget when the median is, more than double that.
Yeah, 100%. And only one of the medians in units is under 650. So I think they basically should be looking to sell the existing property, which isn't ideal given they haven't held it for a long period of time, and put their best foot forward to get that home inside of, and look, potentially that's Mordialloc if it gets them into their school zone. Basically, I would say, look, find the property that in an ideal world can be your forever home, but at least to be able to hold for 7 to 10 years, as I've already said. And if that means with a budget and even with selling the property that is more affordable in Mordialloc than, say, Ormond or any of the other suburbs, that's what I would be trying to achieve. Understanding, okay, what's my highest price point, and then where am I best able to spend that money to get the home that is most likely going to allow my family to live in it forever, and if not forever, at least 7 to 10 years, because we know, and I say 7 to 10 years always, because we know the average property cycle, some can last a decade, and although Melbourne's historically have run for probably 3 to 7 years, I'd like to cover that from a risk management perspective. So you want to be able to hold the home for at least 7 to 10 years.
All right, so Dave's all in on option 2. That's sell the existing and get that big rock in the jar for the forever home, or at least the 5 to 7. Cate, if we're looking at option 4, which is forgetting about the school zones and investing that $650K where we're getting the maximum return, does that idea have legs to you, and how often do you come across this as a Melbourne buyer's agent for people that are desperate to get into these school zones?
All the time. I get so many people asking me about school zones. And the thing about them, depending on the school zone, is you can pay hundreds of thousands of dollars more to get into a school zone. You can be, within 1 or 2 streets from the boundary, and the differential in values is enormous. And whenever I'm analysing, assessing the value of something that's in a dominant school zone or a popular school zone, I have to make sure that all of my comparable sales are in that school zone. Otherwise, I'm comparing apples with oranges. And I'm sure for people with, 4 kids, it's a great deal. When you've got 1 child, I want to challenge that. I want to challenge the return on investment when you're getting reprieve on 1 child's set of school fees, because you might be able to identify a great private school and get the education for your child that you want and put that 650,000 into something that will work for you effectively, but you can stay in the home that you've carefully chosen and the one that you love in the area that suits you. It's something that has to be considered. You've got to run the numbers and look at that return on investment, because they might go through this. Dave's recommendation or Dave's thoughts around what a good option would be given what they want to achieve. I actually agree with Dave. If they were able to have a principal place of residence that's in the location that they want, that's big enough for them, and then think about the investing model, that's great in an ideal world. But as he's just alluded to, they only purchased recently. So to unravel that and to sell the property, to pay the agent's fees, and then pay more stamp duty to get back in, I look at that and think, oh, I wish this conversation was dominant at the time when they first bought their home, because
on
I
episode
hate seeing people.
Berber, as we talked about.
Yeah,
we might have
hate
given a
seeing-
different episode. 267. Here we go. Yeah.
I hate seeing the government getting money out of this because they're unraveling a decision and making a new purchase decision. So I do want them to think about whether they just forget about the school zone, stay where they live, find a great school, pay for it, and put that 650 into something else, because the stamp duty and the agent's selling fees and the marketing, that all needs to be incorporated in their cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? So Dave mentioned correctly before, it's CGT exempt. However, they had to pay the stamp duty going in. They got the agent's fees. So we add those up together. That could be 60 grand, something like that. And then they're kind of doing that again with the stamp duty. And you raise a really good point about the kind of the bulk discount you get with multiple children. If you're going to a zone, you got 4 kids, you can divide it by 4. I'm like, we only really spent, 50 grand on Jonty because we've got 3 other ones. But imagine if you've just got the one and they turn out to be a quantity surveyor or something, a complete waste of money, right? You really want them to be a doctor or something. Dave, I want to ask a question. I was going to say, imagine if they turned out to be a mortgage broker, but I didn't feel like picking on you today.
You're on a roll.
Dave.
Well, if they're not a very good one, it's not good.
Dave is, of course, a very successful one. Now, Dave, I wanted to ask the question.
I'm not
Morty
even a
Alec
mortgage broker anymore, Mike.
No, I know.
We have some very good ones in our team, though.
You absolutely do. I want to ask a question. It seemed like Morty Alec was the cheapest from a median point of view. What would be a mortgage repayment on purchasing in Morty Alec at 1.2, 1.4, whatever it was, compared to what the monthly rent would be, for example? I'm interested if there's a huge gap. I'm suspecting that there would be.
Yeah, to get a family home in Morty Alec, let's say they wanted to get something similar to what they've currently got in the Parkdale school zone. Depending on whether they're going for a large townhouse or a house itself, probably looking at something around that $1 million to 1.6, and the rent that you'd be paying on something like that would be between a 3% and a 3.5% yield, depending on whether it's a house at 3% or a townhouse at 3.5%. So they'll certainly have an economical advantage if they're renting from a cash flow point of view. But obviously and the rent would be offset by the rent that they receive on their current home. So they could rent in the school zone. I can see where you're getting at here, Mike. Yeah. And then they'd have some money left to reinvest elsewhere.
Because that's the thing. And over to you, Dave.
Well, I don't know if they'd have much money left. It definitely would be cheaper, but whether they'd have enough money left to then still go and purchase another property, because if their borrowing capacity at the moment it's only $650, and then they're paying a significant rent, I imagine it would bring their borrowing capacity down to, or purchase price down to $450 or even lower. So they probably wouldn't have a lot left, but it would be the actual outlay, as Cate's just gone through, would be lower with the rent versus paying a mortgage. And that actually is another. They could rent for a period of time in one of those locations to get a better sense of which, if they're happy in that suburb, if they want to better understand the streets, the location in terms of where they'd like to purchase. But I probably wouldn't want to be doing that for too long, because we do think the Melbourne property market is going to move forward at a reasonable sum over the next couple of years. So I think the longer they wait, the more they're probably going to get priced out.
Yep.
Cate, Josephine's obviously no mug. If she's actually highlighted some properties that she thinks she can snag in that sort of 650 range, I'm sure it's not completely impossible, but it's going to involve compromise and challenges potentially. What is in the crystal ball if they go down that path and look to get something at that price point?
Look, I think from a physical point of view, this property will feel very small for them. They're not going to get a 3-bedder. And, from a harmonious family interaction point of view, will they be tripping over each other and resenting being cooped up in a tight flat or a little unit? And also they'll be buying into a strata complex, and they'll have outgoings. Obviously, they need to be very careful with their due diligence and their foresight when it comes to understanding what sort of maintenance costs will be associated with that building. Because if it's a much older unit complex, they might be up for some special levies going forward. So all of that, I think, is a complexity that needs to be well understood if they're going to do this. And if they do find that their incomes increase and their servicing increases, and their son gets to year 9, year 10, and they feel like they absolutely need to get something bigger, well, they'll be facing another sale and another purchase. And I'm really concerned about eroding savings and capital by having a series of purchasing purchase activity going where you, like we've said, paying stamp duty and selling costs. I really think they need to consider how it's going to feel when he's doing VCE. What sort of space do they need, and what privacy and also study space will he need?
Gosh, I hate stamp duty. I mean, I often think about, like, how much did this stamp cost, and are there other options? Could we handwrite, the stamp? Like, the government across all states, I think, is banking around about $1 billion a week for stamp duty, which is just absolutely crazy, and it's such an impediment to people moving to the areas that are best suited for them. But those are the rules at the moment, and we have to look at that. Dave, you sort of pitched your flag.
The New South Wales government had a little attempt to transition to land tax.
Yes.
And then it got quashed by the Labor government when they got into power. So it's just so hard to make that transition from stamp duty to land tax.
I actually thought that would end up being legislated, and then it would be a domino of all the other states falling into line. But it doesn't seem like the time is ripe for that kind of revolution at the moment.
Yeah.
No.
Hopefully.
Dave, you pitched your flag on option 2. Let's drill down into that, if you wouldn't mind. So we're talking about selling their current home and upgrading to the point where they're not as compromised in what they're looking at, as Cate just elucidated. What are some of the financial pros and cons to that approach?
Yeah, well, look, just some of the entire pros and cons, whether financial or lifestyle. I'll just run through a few of those. So the pros include getting into a better asset, worth more value now, which increases their scope for capital growth from that home over the longer term. From a lifestyle perspective, this is a big one. They don't need to compromise and live in a unit, which we've spoken about, for multiple years, and the impact, feels squashed for space, and the challenges that can arise from raising a family versus living in a confined space versus living in a home with outdoor area for their son and themselves, and extra room for entertaining and providing space for each other within the house. A third pro is if they didn't take this path and did purchase the unit, there's no guarantee that they wouldn't end up selling that unit as well as their first property to get into the long-term home down the track anyway. And
that'd be a bad result, wouldn't it? Two sales to get to where they want to be rather than one.
Yeah, and you often see that. Like, it's not uncommon. You often see people tried really hard to buy multiple investment properties in the early stages of life, and they've got some great returns from them, but then they do end up selling 1, 2, or even 3 investment properties to get into that long-term home at that stage of life. So, rather than go down that path, let's get the home locked away now. The sooner you get the long-term home, as I've spoken about, it's a big rock in the jar. So the earlier you can pay that debt down and focus on investing for the longer term. And we know the power of compound growth over your lifetime. So a fourth pro is, because we think the market is going to rise a fair bit over the next couple of years, is our best bet, or certainly mine, in Melbourne. The sooner they get in, given the higher price point, the better. And then not, as we've probably touched on briefly, not renting provides stability, certainty of the school zoning. If you can get the son into the school sooner rather than later, mindful that boundaries can change due to densification of a suburb or popularity of a school. So they're the list of the pros, and then just a few cons would be having to sell the first property isn't ideal. I'm sure that probably breaks Josephine's heart a little bit just to even listen to that being discussed.
Yeah.
And having had many meetings with those conversations, like hundreds over the journey, you've got to have that conversation. The sooner you have it, some people will, it'll make sense to them right away. Some people will need a month or two to digest it. Some people will need even longer. When it is the right decision to sell that property. Not saying it always is, but sometimes you need a while to digest that thought, because there's often such an emotional attachment to that first property in particular that you purchased. So they haven't held it for long. It probably hasn't performed that well because Melbourne hasn't done that much in a short period of time. So they might feel some loss aversion. And we know humans find it much harder or much more motivated by loss aversion than actually the receipt of, or the potential receipt of income. So that's how the human psyche works. Loss aversion is a huge driver in what humans do. Second con is holding this property and purchasing another property. Actually, potential would get more money in the marketplace. So we don't know what their first home's worth, but generally speaking, if you can buy 2 investment properties, your total purchasing power is greater than 1 home. So they're probably, instead of, let's say, if they sold and purchased, let's say they're able to purchase for 1.5. But if they bought 2 investment properties, let's say the first home's already worth 1.2, and then they can spend 650, they'd have 1.85 in the marketplace versus 1.5, if that makes sense. Yes. So having 2 investment properties, you're going to have probably more total value in the property market. So there's the potential for greater return overall. And as we've touched on, a third benefit is you could just focus on a pure investment of 650 rather than sort of a quasi unit home that Cate's already elucidated potentially won't cut the mustard anyway. So there are sort of a list of the pros and cons of that pathway.
And you raise a very good point about how, we are talking about a big life decision for Josephine and her family. So it was nice for you to recognise that some of these options might not sit very well, but sometimes you have to have that hard conversation with yourself to understand that you're going in the right direction. And if that is the decision that they make, Cate, then what are the tactical challenges between selling and sort of buying together in close proximity and targeting one of these locations within the zones?
Yes, this conversation comes up a lot because I deal with a lot of people that are transitioning, whether they're upgrading or downsizing or right-sizing. So they've got to contemplate how they manage not being homeless and not spending a fortune on temporary accommodation and not spending a fortune on bridging finance if they're eligible, and that I'll let Dave talk about that next. But the way that I prefer to do this is to have flexibility on either your purchase or your settlement, ideally both, when I'm referring to settlement dates. And if the property that they're looking to buy is more scarce than the property they're wanting to sell, they probably should think about getting out there and finding their next home first and then selling. But if the property that they want to sell is a more difficult sale than the property that they want to purchase, they might have to think about selling first and then purchasing. And for everyone, whichever option you pick, there's always that dreaded thought, how do I make sure that either my settlement date is perfectly aligned on the purchase and the sale so that I can have the truck packed with all of my gear and the boxes dropped at my new house. And if you need to have a night or two in an Airbnb or a hotel, that's not the end of the world. But what you don't want to do is find that they're not overlapping. And so you can't manage to settle your purchase because you haven't got your sale funds. And it does feel precarious, but when you have a long settlement approach with a bit of flex, it can be done. So, for example, you might say to your selling agent, we want you to find a buyer that's happy to give us a 120-day settlement or a 150-day settlement or something flexible, or even find us a buyer who's an investor that will let us rent back for a few months, because that buys you a little bit of flex and a bit of time on the purchase side of things. And the same can be said when it's in reverse, because if you can then say to the agent that you're purchasing from, this is the date that I need to settle, well, that can be managed. Or you might have some flex on the other side and say to your purchaser, look, we want to move the settlement date as we agreed in the contract. We want to bring it forward or push it back. So it's all about allowing yourself flex and allowing yourself time. But it is a bit scary for some. And there is a bit of reprieve if you're able to A, get bridging finance, or B, have somewhere temporary that you can stay that's not expensive. You know, that could be house sitting for someone. It could be staying with relatives that have a big house. All of these things are conversations, though, that need to take place before you go slapping up a sold sticker or listing your property and not discussing with your agent what your settlement terms need to be.
Yeah, great advice. And I remember you commenting a couple of episodes ago that the extended settlements in Melbourne are in vogue at the moment for whatever reason, and quite possibly part of the reason why we haven't seen price appreciation on CoreLogic's median numbers as yet, because if we're talking about a 4-month settlement, that's quite a long time horizon. So obviously there's precedence for doing this in Victoria. Dave, from a finance point of view, what do we need to understand? Cate sort of referenced things like bridging finance. You know, I'm interested in the portability of the loan. Like what tips and tricks have we got up our sleeves to navigate this situation?
Look, like most things in life, it's not about the tips and tricks. It's about the meat and potatoes, as you say, Mike, or as I say with my sport coaching. It's the fundamentals, and it's the same with business. It's the same with, you know, setting yourself up to make good property decisions. So you need to go and work out your borrowing capacity. You know, you need to actually get a pre-approval in place. You need to get really clear on what is the likely sale price of your existing property. You need to understand, okay, actually, am I approved for bridging finance if I want to go down that path? Can I make that work? For a lot of people, it's not an option because they don't have enough equity in their existing property, and they won't have enough equity when they settle on the new home. So you need to go put the work in. You need to get to work and figure out the answers and actually get them formalized with actual approvals. Okay. And then, you know, through that process, you have those conversations with your strategic mortgage broker about the pros and cons that Cate's just very clearly articulated about buying first or selling first. And then you make a decision that feels right for you with the full knowledge of how much you approved for, and having done the comparable, you know, assessments around the sale price of your house. But just as equally, you need to have spent, I would say, 2 to 3 months on the ground looking at what properties are selling for that you would potentially look to buy, and have that knowledge on the other side of the scale, or however you want to describe it. So, you know, you do the basics, you do the fundamentals, you do the work, and you be prepared.
I like that, Dave. Eat the veggies, I used to say.
Eat the veggies, yes.
You can have your dessert, but you got to eat your veggies first, and that's the work. So we've really broken it down to 4 options. One is to compromise and buy something small, and we've discussed some of the issues with that. The second one is to sell their current home and upgrade into zone, and obviously we recognise the fact that might be a hard thing to get the head around. Number 3 is wait and hope they can buy something bigger in the zone, presuming that their incomes grow. And 4 is rent vest. I want to go to both of you to pick a number and give us your insights as to why you think that's maybe the approach that has legs.
Well, look, I think I've already sort of covered the approach that I think on the face of it would make sense for them.
Yep.
And obviously Cate's, other suggestion was with one child to consider a private school, and then you can, stay living where you are, and then zoning becomes irrelevant. And so that's obviously another consideration for them. But I'd probably, there's probably not much more for me to add. I think I've covered most of the core considerations around that scenario.
We did lean into the sort of the homework, assuming option 2 a little bit harder. So I think that's fair to say that's where you're landing, Dave. What about you, Cate?
I think rent vesting has some merit if they're really keen to pursue the public schooling option. What I'm really reluctant to see them do is make another purchase that might be unravelled. This is a hard podcast to listen to when you've sent in a listener question and we're saying this home that you love, that you're really proud of, that you structured perfectly, might be on the discussion table for being sold. That will hurt them. You said that yourself, Mike. So I don't want to see them have to go through this discussion again. I think they've got to make a really clear decision. And it's a bit of a decision matrix, isn't it? Do we really care about the private school or the public school option? Which one are we favouring now that we've got all of the options on the table? And if it's still public school, then how passionate are we about owning the property that we live in that public school zone? And how wedded to our current home are we? And how suitable is our current home post-school? Once he's grown up, is this still the home that we want to live in? There's some of the questions they need to be asking themselves. Because if the answer is, yes, we really love that particular home, and no, we're not wedded to being in the school zone in a home that we love or that we own, go and rent something. So there's quite a few decisions here on the decision matrix tree, and I think that's the beauty of it. We've opened this discussion, and they don't need to be sitting there feeling like they're licking their wounds. If they love this home that they're in and they can see a future for it, rent vesting might be an option, or private school might be an option. So the good thing is there are options, and they've recognise that they have growing incomes, and with that will come growing servicing. They've got options. What I don't want to see them do is buy something and sell something on a short tenure. Dave said it before, 7 to 10 years. If someone comes to me and says, I'm thinking of buying something, but I might want to sell it in the next 5, I say I'm not the advocate for you, and I really want you to tell me that you'll hold it for at least 10.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, some really good insights and some options there for Josephine, but let's go to our gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
I think that they got so much right with their structuring, and the first listener question that we did in the Josephine series, if I can call it that, they got so much right. But what I wish they did was talked about the importance of zoning and whether school zones were something that needed to be factored into their decision. And they might have made this decision on the house that they're in, before they had thought about school or even before they had a child. So I'm definitely not wrapping them over the knuckles. I'm just saying that I think when people are looking to property plan, this is a big part of it. Hypothetically, if we have children, are we believers in public schooling or private schooling, and how important is zoning and particular schools? It's in the primary set of considerations. I can see Dave nodding. This is all about
exactly,
good property
we've both
planning.
landed at the same point. That's got them in this position for our gold nugget. So I was going to talk to this point as well. Everyone who hasn't set a property plan yet, you can be asking yourself these questions ahead of time. And sure, you may not head down the path in terms of the way you answer all these questions when you initially go through that. But there is the potential that Josephine and her husband, as Cate has just talked about, could have determined this in advance of buying the last property and therefore already purchased the first property inside of these zones. And so exactly to Cate's point, that's why you set up a property plan. It's not just about modelling out what's my property wealth going to look like at retirement. It's also about getting these near and midterm decisions right, particularly around the family home, so you don't end up in a dilemma like Josephine is now.
She does mention in her question, at the time, our budget wouldn't stretch to buying in those school zones mentioned. So that's why they sort of purchased the property that they did. But yeah, of course, I agree with those points. Ideally, you want to have a long-term plan rather than getting down the track and going, oh, well, actually now things are a little bit different because look, I suppose I'll try and weave it into my gold nugget is that anything that doesn't result in 2 sales is a win, right? So if we have to sell that property and we upgrade into zone because maybe that property hopefully has grown a little bit, even though you've only just held it for a little bit, hopefully the incomes are increasing and you've got a little bit more borrowing capacity, well, that's just 1 sale. But if you do buy something that's a compromise in the zone, then it won't be your forever home, won't be fit for purpose, and you may possibly need to be selling the 2 of them. I really like the idea of rent vesting and taking that money elsewhere around the country for the best investment hotspot that you can find. And then, 5 or 10 years down the track, you maybe have that option where you've got 2 properties that have appreciated and you've actually got a little bit more to play with to maybe look at your owner occ and keep one of the investment properties, or if you're happy renting, to continue building out that portfolio until you get to the point where you have a fair stack to buy that property. But I think the real big one is trying to avoid the buying and selling stuff, because every time you clip that ticket, it costs money.
Yep.
Yeah, and look, I say if you're going to be willing to rent vest, you should be considering 7 to 10 years, because people often think it can be too short of a period, and what still ends up happening is they sell the properties they've purchased and they change their mind about being happy renting after 3 years or 4 years. So I try to really paint it being a long-term 7 to 10 years and potentially 10 years, because you don't want people to go in with rose-coloured glasses, which often they do, only to unwind it in a short period of time anyway. So that's in terms of rent vesting. And in terms of advisors, part of an advisor's job is to challenge people's thinking. And she said, look, they couldn't afford to purchase in there. But, then she's now talking about potentially getting a 2-bedroom unit for $650 in those zones. And they have bought a 3-bedroom, is it a townhouse or what have you? They moved a bit further out. I suspect they could have purchased a 2-bedroom unit in one of the zones when they bought the first property 2 or 3 years ago. So they potentially could have had, I think if they really challenged themselves, I suspect almost certainly they would have been able to buy some property in one of those zones at that point in time. Just
perhaps not the standalone 3 and 2 that they had to go a bit further out for at the time.
Yeah, exactly. So, these are, but it would have been better to have really teased that out further. And then the ramifications that we're now talking about now, 3, 4, 5 years ago when they were making that decision.
Which is hard because it's too late for Josephine, but it's a cautionary tale for other listeners. But from Josephine's perspective, we've laid 4 different options out on the table and shared some pros and cons for both. And I guess now it's over to you, and we would love to hear the direction that you go on. And we do want to say a big thank you for coming back and asking us another question on the show, because there will be a number of people who face situations like this or are in that situation at the moment, and hopefully they'll get some value out of this as well. So, guys,
actually,
thanks very much.
Just one other point too, Mike, is, and you might think, I'm potentially being a bit tough talking about some of these potential learnings that could have been not happened in the first decision. One of the reasons you need to do that is because people make the same mistakes more than once.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So you talk through it again so they don't make the same mistake a second time or a third time.
Yeah, ideally not.
Yeah.
Well, Josephine, hopefully you've got some value out of that. We'd love to hear how you get on with that. But thank you very much for that question. And thank you to the both of you for sharing your wisdom on that today. It's been a great episode.
Thanks,
Thank you.
guys.
Cheers.